Would you say last night was just a celebration of white supremacy?
Yeah, I think that that's a very hard conclusion to avoid. Adolf Hitler's chief propagandist, Joseph Goebbels, used to say it's easier to get the public to believe a big lie than a small one. And what he meant was if you create such a all-encompassing, completely dominating picture of the world that bears no resemblance to reality, people might think that it's inconceivable that that could be false, right? And that's exactly what we've seen this week in the Republican convention. And the idea that this is happening while basically a young man who amounts to a stochastic terrorist, that's basically a person committing political acts of violence, believing to be inspired by the acts and wishes of a leader, has happened, is something that you cannot separate from what we saw on our screens. This young man is an impassioned Trump supporter, an impassioned police supporter. He goes to Trump rallies. He goes online and presents videos, believing himself to be an armed vigilante protecting the nation against these dark and frightening hordes. And I've made an absolute commitment not to talk about the election of Donald Trump and his attempt to retain power only by talking about voters and electoral votes, because he's appealing so adamantly to the kind of people who will take up arms in the streets if he loses. One of the things we need to understand when it comes to the history of authoritarian strongmen is they're so lawless and their janissaries and enablers are so lawless that they know that if they lose, they may well be called to account for their breaking of the laws. And that makes it an absolute desperate imperative that they not lose. And that's when you see the most frightening developments. You know, the idea that you cannot allow elections to stand. You know, that's what we saw in Chile in 1970. They lost an election, and that's when they, bombed the presidential palace, right? That's in 1973 when they bombed the presidential palace, but that's when they seized the generals seized power by force of arms, because they knew that were they to lose, they would be held responsible for the crimes that they'd committed.
Take us to Reaganland and the similarities you see, Reagan, Trump, and how Trump has taken it further.
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out ways to express these very subtle similarities and differences. And one thing I'll say right now is that Ronald Reagan would definitely say 2 + 2 = 5, right? There's no question about it. But when he would say things like that, it tended to be the off-the-cuff stuff, not the stuff that his speechwriters had written, right? Whereas when Donald Trump takes a podium and he's reading a speech, that's when he lies the most adamantly. And it shows that the kind of lying, deception, propaganda, authoritarianism is qualitatively more systematic than under Ronald Reagan. But at the same time, that it would not have been possible without Ronald Reagan and the movement around him kind of priming the Republican electorate and Republican elected officials for this kind of lawlessness and viciousness.
And you, of course, say that Reagan was one of the most dangerous presidents in U.S. history.
There's no question, right? I mean, whether a guy cuts, 80% out of the public housing budget in 8 years, as Ronald Reagan did with a smile or a scowl, the effect is the same, right? And one of the most dangerous things that Ronald Reagan did as president was something we saw all over in this Republican convention, which is that idea that people who criticize America are not quite Americans, right? That is the Reagan legacy, not only to America, but to the United States. And that's something that is completely unquestioned in the Republican Party.